Hello and welcome to Comic Island. My name is Arden, and today we're talking about Wolverine number 5. So, I'm kind of sneaking in one more review today, and I'm quite glad that I picked up this latest issue of Wolverine. For those that haven't seen my earlier reviews, it's a pretty fun series that involves a confluence of different plots, mostly establishing this rising Russian rival nation to Krakoa, as well as this growth of a vampire nation in response to humanity being essentially distracted by all the mutant stuff going on in the larger world of the X-Men, and just a larger discussion of Wolverine's place in a world post House of X. Now, up until now, I've really liked the series. Each issue has been its own powerful little thing. I would say Wolverine number 5 is a little bit different than that. While it possesses the similar creative team, you have Benjamin Percy writing it, Victor Bogdanovic doing the artwork, which is, I don't know if he's new or not, but I know Matthew Wilson does the coloring, Corey Petit lettering, and Tom Miller design. They all do a good job at really conveying the almost surreal but bracing, brutal nature of Logan, which has been true for the entire Wolverine series. But while the other books have been like expansive stuff that really are well connected to the rest of the X-Men franchise, this book is a little more standalone. Now, it makes a lot of sense. Last issue, Wolverine kind of isolated himself from the X-Men, which proved to be a huge mistake as it essentially left him vulnerable to this trap set by the Vampire Nation. This book is essentially dealing with the fallout of that, so it's relatively self-contained and kind of just continuing that sort of thing. Unlike last book, I don't think it's kind of like this relatively fun standalone book. It's pretty important in the overall series of Wolverine, but you kind of have to be a little bit caught up at this point to fully appreciate what's going on here. So I think I'd still recommend it if you've been enjoying Wolverine so far, or if you check out my earlier reviews, you can kind of get a sense of whether or not this series would be of interest to you. But personally, I think it's a good direction and a good Wolverine series from like just based on the standard of what I might usually expect out of a Wolverine comic book. It feels well written to the era of Krakoa and the X-Men very changed and different. Logan very much has a niche here and finds meaning in still like dealing with his darkness and dealing with the need to keep the X-Men safe, and has a lot of work to do because he really pays for his mistake here. We open with Logan basically being encased in a block of ice that's pulled out of the pond that Omega Red basically drowned him in, and the event Dracula shows up. They drill a little hole into the ice block and use it to fill in these little blood things into 3 cups that allow 3 vampires, including Dracula, to walk around in the day thanks to Logan's unique blood, which they talked about in the previous issue, but they even kind of visualize it in this cool little page that they do in all of the X-Men books, but this one's really neat, and it talks about Logan's blood type, which Beast has called Type E. It's kind of neat because it does the real world distributions of all the different blood types. So, for example, I'm A positive, which is 1 in 3. 32% of the human population has that particular blood type. But Logan's type E is 1 person in 8 billion, referring to the fact that he has truly unique blood and all that stuff. Beast was talking about in one of those logs in one of the previous issues about how vampires are like Logan's closest relative. So it makes sense what the vampires are doing. It's all been well established at this point. Then we get a cut of them. What we later learn is them wiping out an entire town. Meanwhile, these 3 teenage vampires somehow stumble onto Logan completely unguarded in an interesting moment that's clearly like done intentionally. And the vampire kids escape with Wolverine, and the ice starts to crack and he breaks out because, Logan can survive everything, so we all knew he was going to escape from that ice eventually. I'm glad it didn't take forever. We then cut to Minneapolis, Minnesota, where the vampires that wiped out that town show up in a transport truck with basically all these bodies that they've pulled together. All those bodies are now full-fledged vampires, so they've been converted, and they get unleashed into the middle of the city, basically told, well, there's plenty of food around here, have fun. And it's just part of that strategy we've been talking about throughout this Wolverine series. The Vampire Nation is expanding, and this is one hell of a way to start spreading around their plague, for lack of a better term. It's good stuff. It's well drawn, nicely animated. I'm just looking down and noticing that there's a bar called Percy's, which is an obvious reference to the writer, but hey, it just adds a little bit of flair to the scene in Minneapolis, and it's probably my favorite part in the whole book. Logan gets to know the teenage vampires who are apparently like, I don't know, they're trying to reform themselves. They drink the blood of animals. It's been explored in past works of like vampire fiction beyond Marvel, but it's fine, whatever. He makes some allies, and there's still a bit of a mystery as to why Logan was deliberately let go, but they managed to track down the two vampires that are currently empowered by Logan's blood. It's an interesting point that they're able to just collect all these bodies in night and day. I think it would be conveyed a little bit better if one of these scenes took place in the day and we actually saw these vampires out in the day. They don't actually show us that, though. All the scenes take place in nighttime, which is thematically working with the overall tone of the book. But if one of these scenes had taken place during the day, that point would be shown, not told in the dialogue. And I wish they had done that, but I digress. Logan shows up on snowmobiles with the vampire teens, and these wooden stakes like mounted to the snowmobiles, and Logan's claws drawn. They violently attack the vampires. The teens kind of get decimated, but Logan does his thing and takes the vampires out. They talk about how what makes sense, that they left Logan unguarded on purpose, and they basically got what they want. Basically this was all just to buy them time and let them do their crazy plan of spreading the stuff around. And they didn't want Logan to die, is their big thing. If they had done too much damage to him, or if he had disappeared for too long, then the other X-Men would have gotten involved, and they weren't ready for that. But Logan's like, well, time's up, and I'm coming for you and Omega Red, because now he knows that Omega Red's a traitor, and now he knows the vampires are a real problem. However, couple howevers. I will say, I think, first of all, it's pretty clear that was the whole point, though. That's what the vampires wanted. They just needed to buy a little bit of time and not a lot. Because I think the vampires are very much aware stuff's about to go down for the X-Men. I guess with Russia, or maybe the vampires are involved with what's going on in Russia. It does kind of seem that way. And either way, their whole point was just to delay Logan at least a bit so that their numbers can swell and whatever they have planned is still just coming along. I'm curious if all that's connected to some of the recent stuff going on with Dracula and the vampires and all that content over in Jason Aaron's Avengers books a little while back, but I'm not fully caught up on all those Avengers books, so I don't know if that's a thing or if that connective tissue exists at all, but I do think it fits together. It kind of makes sense that the vampires would be posed to maneuver themselves in this direction after all the stuff that went down with the Avengers. But I don't know. Even maybe just on the basic premise of, well, Blade's an Avenger now, so the vampires maybe want to amp up their game, and that's why they've been making inroads with the X-Men, given that the X-Men basically presented them with an opportunity. It's interesting stuff. Finally, there's a little epilogue, which I quite like, because the book basically ends. They say next, X of Swords, they have the coming soon, and then there's an extra little page where Logan's wandering in the woods, presumably to get back to a Krakoan gate or something like that. Karsta's saying, hey, sorry I wasn't here helping my sister move because she's going to college. Well, that's cool, man. It's exciting times and stuff, but you don't have to apologize. It's all good. We're just going over what happens in this Wolverine book. Anyways, Logan's wandering in the woods. I guess he senses what's about to happen because he starts ranting about like, I got stuff to do, don't do this, and a rainbow bridge surrounds him, and he disappears and reemerges somewhere else and swears. um, while a voice just says, your concerns matter little, you are needed elsewhere, which is kind of interesting because to me that means his whole point of like, oh, I'm gonna warn the X-Men and raise them against the vampires might not happen anytime soon, and Logan might be seriously derailed for the events of X of Swords. If so, that's pretty interesting. And I'm curious what presumably the Asgardians want with Logan. Maybe that was Odin. Maybe that was literally another Asgardian or Thor himself. But well, I don't know. A lot of possibilities there, and I thought that was an amusing sudden change of pace. I'm curious where this series is going to go from here. Logan's a nice mix, or sorry, the Wolverine series is a nice mix of unpredictable, fun action, interesting connective tissue to the rest of the X-Men series, and just classic Wolverine brutality. This book is no different, but like I kind of said at the beginning of my review, this book's a little more ingrained in the existing continuity of Logan, whereas past issues stood alone a little bit and were good in just setting up their own content in and of themselves. This is a bit more of payoff, particularly of the events of issue number 4. Still, it was fun, and I definitely enjoyed reading it. And I think, like I said, you would too, as long as you're caught up and like this particular take on Wolverine. I believe it's strong, though. It's right in line with, like, the kind of content I would expect out of a typical Wolverine series, just with the added flair of the X-Men existing in a new world. And I'm so glad they didn't walk away from that in this Wolverine series, while he still is often on his own, doing his own thing in his solo series. It's a nice and healthy balance so far that works well. Even in these last 2 issues, when he's been pretty alone, it still feels like this story is relevant to its current era of X-Men and is taking advantage of all those cool and creative ideas out there, which I think is for the best. It might date this series to a degree one day if the X-Men will eventually have to change in some form or another. So we might not look back on this the same way, but for now these books are fun, and I think they still have value on their own. Like last issue was just an interesting book, even if you don't know anything about the X-Men, because it's just about Logan going off on his own to this bar, and the mistake of all of that is explored rather thoroughly, and I quite enjoyed it, but think I could hand that book to somebody who just knows the most basic things about Wolverine and they could enjoy it. That's absolutely not true for Wolverine number 5, but it's still a strong enough book on its own, and I enjoyed it. I based on the cover alone, I expected Wolverine to be fighting vampires in this book, and I was not disappointed. But it isn't all this book features either. Though I will say the stuff with the vampire teens, while fun compared to the rest of the Wolverine series, is much weaker. I will say that. Carson was saying, I think Odin saw the future where Logan killed Thor or Loki. That's interesting. I thought it also might have to do with the fact that Logan is more cosmically attuned at this point. After all that stuff with the blue Infinity Stone and all that business with Infinity Wars kind of being a huge part of his return, that's where I kind of also potentially interpreted things. Though it really, that rainbow bridge could take him anywhere, I feel. And it could be so many people, because it's like, well, Heimdall could do that, Thor could do that, depending on, especially on where we're looking at Thor continuity and what level they want to pull from. Because if we're talking the Thor core series, yeah, but Odin as well. And I feel like other characters could pull that off, or even like one of those characters I mentioned could just be transporting Logan on behalf of someone else. Jane Foster, for example. It's a fun little epilogue. Like I said, I really like that little page because it's just like, oh, here's a curveball, and it's a fun curveball. The kind of curveball that you can do in Marvel Comics and is always welcome, in my opinion, especially in something like this Wolverine series where it's like, well, he was about to like raise hell with the X-Men and just got diverted. I think that's fun, especially on the eve of the X-Men entering this big event thing. Like Wolverine might have just been checked out of that whole event now. I don't know if that's true or not, but if so, that's kind of interesting. Because certainly Axe of Swords could be about a lot of different characters, and if Logan's just pulled out of it, that could be cool. Or he's going to go on this little adventure right before it, and it's going to set up. I don't know. It could be so many things, and it's completely out of left field with everything that's been covered in Logan so far, or sorry, Wolverine, the series so far, and I think there's a lot of potential there. So, yeah, pretty cool issue overall, and I'm quite excited to see what happens next. Speaking of next, I still have 3 more comics to review from this week because it was a hefty pull to say the least. Stuff like this Shazam book I had ordered months ago and got delayed until, well, last Wednesday. And I've been looking forward to talking about this one. I teased it a good long while ago, and it's finally here. And to be honest, it was kind of worth the wait. This is that Jeff Johns book I was talking about, so it'll be an interesting discussion overall. So stay tuned for that, but we'll save that for tomorrow, hopefully, if not Monday. Like, if not, Monday. And I got a couple more books after that, including the much anticipated return of Marvel Zombies. So stay tuned for that. Thanks for joining me, Karsten, and everyone else, and those of you who are watching after. See you guys next time.